We're here today to interview Dr. Del Siegle for the National Association for Gifted Children Legacy Archive Project. Dr. Siegle is Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Affairs at the University of Connecticut. At the same time, he is also the Director for the National Center on Research on Gifted Education. He's a professor of gifted education and talent development and originator of the Achievement Orientation Model. He has a long list of experiences in the field of gifted education. He's a past president of the National Association for Gifted Children. He's past chair of the AERA Special Interest Group on Research on Giftedness, Creativity, and Talent. He has been co-editor of the Journal of Advanced Academics and Gifted Child Quarterly. He writes a technology column for Gifted Child Today, and along with Gary Davis and Sylvia Rim, he's co-author of the popular textbook, Education of the Gifted and Talented. Prior to going into higher ed, Del was a teacher of the gifted in Montana. He has received numerous recognitions for his work. He's a recipient of both the NAGC Early Leader and Distinguished Scholar Award, or Distinguished Service Award. He was recognized as a friend of the gifted by associations in both Connecticut and Montana. And at the University of Connecticut, he was recognized as Outstanding Young Investigator, and he is a teaching fellow. Dr. Siegle,
Hi.
You clearly wear many hats.
I wear some of those hats better than others, I guess.
And that is our first question,
Okay.
interestingly. So how do you define yourself? Are you a teacher of the gifted? Are you a researcher? A promoter of gifted programs? A creator? Are you a troublemaker? A policymaker? Or other?
Boy, I like all of those. I started out as a teacher, and so I taught gifted students in Montana for 8 years. And in that role as a teacher, I always needed to learn more things about how to serve the kids and what their needs were. And so in that process, I started educating myself. And in the process of educating myself, I became affiliated with associations like the National Association for Gifted Children, as well as the Montana Association, AGIT. And so the teaching actually led into the leadership world because I became involved in those associations, so I started to take on leadership roles. And that leadership caused me to meet people such as Joe Renzulli and Sally Reese at the University of Connecticut, and they offered me this opportunity to study with them for the Ph.D. And so the leadership ultimately led to the scholarship because through the Ph.D. program I became a scholar. So my teaching led to leadership, my leadership led to scholarship, and so I do all of those. I still teach, and I still teach gifted children. They just happen to be 18, 19, 20 years old, and in some cases doc students older than that. But I'm still teaching gifted children, just at a slightly older age range.
So you've contributed considerably to the field. So I want you to think on some of those contributions. So what do you consider to be your most significant contribution to the field? Can you describe it?
It's interesting, Michael Pirate, who's now deceased, when he was asked what his greatest contribution was, he said, well, I hope it's the next study I do, and I love that. But for the past, I think my greatest accomplishment is the Achievement Orientation Model. It takes pieces from psychology and educational psychology that have always existed and puts them together. Others have put some of those pieces together, but nobody put the various pieces that we have with the model. So I think the Achievement Orientation Model is a good model. We used it to try to understand underachievement because in the process of studying underachievement, we discovered that we needed to really be studying motivation. And so with the Achievement Orientation Model, there are 3 factors or beliefs that individuals have to have, and if they don't have those beliefs, then they tend not to achieve. And so one of those is self-efficacy or confidence. People have to be confident in their ability to do something. If you don't believe you can achieve a task, if you don't believe you can accomplish the task, you won't try in the first place. So you have to have that self-efficacy, but that isn't sufficient. The second thing you have to do is that you have to find the task as meaningful. And we sometimes call that goal valuation. If you don't think it's important, you won't bother. So I may think that I can do mathematics, but if I don't think mathematics is important, then I won't attempt it. And then the third factor is that you have to trust that the environment is going to support you. You have to believe that there's a support system for you. Because if you think people are going to block your achievement, why would you ever try? So a lot of times for many students in schools, one of those factors or several of those factors are missing. Some kids don't believe they can do math or reading or whatever it is, and so they don't try. Other kids don't think it's important, they don't find it meaningful, and other kids don't feel that they're in a system that really values it and would support them. So you have to have all three of those. And when you have all three of those, you tend to find ways to self-regulate and achieve. And so that model has been tested by a number of other researchers, and it's including yourself, actually. It's holding well. We've tweaked it a little as we've gone along, and you've had some influence on the interaction with the self-regulation back and forth between the three belief components. But I think that's my greatest accomplishment. Right now, the National Center for Research on Gifted Education, which is the federally funded center through the Javits Act, the work we're doing on underserved populations is very important. And I think ultimately that will probably be my greater contribution. But we're still working on it.
Okay, so how do you think your work has influenced the field?
I think the achievement orientation models had some influence. There have probably been a half a dozen or a dozen researchers that have used it now in studies. So that's had some influence. The work at the center now, the National Center, that's already starting to have some influence. We had a nice article come out in the January issue of Gifted Child Quarterly, because what we're discovering is that students of poverty are less likely to be identified, and that's not new news. Everybody knew that if you were a student of poverty, you were less likely to be identified for gifted programs, but the work we're doing, what we've discovered is that those students of poverty, even when they have the same achievement as non-students of poverty, they have a lower chance of being identified. So a student of poverty does not get identified at the same rate with the same achievement as a non-student of poverty, and that is really a travesty that we need to look at, and we can easily fix that with some modifications in identification in this country. So hopefully the work that we're doing at the National Center will ultimately have policy implications and will change the way states set their criteria for identification and also the way schools set their criteria. So I think that probably will be the most influential.
There's a famous quote by William Wordsworth, and it says, "The child is father of the man." How has your background influenced your direction, your career, and your contributions in gifted education?
I grew up in rural Montana, 200 miles from the closest airport. Everyone in town knew everyone, little town. And I grew up in a family that didn't have many resources as far as money, but a lot of resources as far as love and feeling important and belonging to something and belonging to community. And so my father was a very creative man, and so that was probably the biggest influences, is seeing him. Because of the lack of resources, he had to use his creativity more often. And so I grew up in an environment where creativity was valued, and trying alternative ways of doing things and not having to fit the norm were really important. My mother was a very resourceful woman, and so I also learned about maximizing resources. So those really kind of set the stage for who I was. But my work in Glendive, Montana, with the students in the gifted program, was called the STEP program, Special Talents Education Program. Working with those kids changed my life. I ended up in gifted ed just by accident. I didn't go to college till I was 26, and so consequently, I was older than most students on campus. I had worked in photography for 8 years. And so when I went to college, it was a time in my life where everything was interesting. Every class I attended, there was just so much of value in that class, and I just really embraced learning at that point in my life, and I hope I've continued to do that. So when I graduated, I had a very good GPA, and consequently, when I went out to look for jobs, school saw my GPA and said, "Oh, he has a high GPA, he can teach gifted." So my first job in gifted ed, I had no background whatsoever, but I had a high GPA, which is not a qualification to teach gifted kids. But I was smart enough to know that I needed to learn something. So what I did was I headed out to take classes, and I went to Minneapolis. I came out here to Connecticut, to Confortute, And that first summer before I started teaching, I picked up 15 credits in gifted ed, believe it or not. Now, I had to travel quite a bit to get those 15 credits living in Montana, but that gave me a great background to get started. And once you've worked with gifted kids, you're hooked. I mean, they changed my life, and I'm in contact with many of those kids still. So they just gave me a whole passion for life and passion for this field. And so that background working with the kids was essential.
So you talked about creativity, and you talked about interest, and how the college classes that you took sparked your interest. So we're going to build on that. You know that there are sort of things that happen in our lives that incite curiosity in us. You can read something, you can visit somewhere. So you've talked a little bit more about that, but what would you consider significant influences on the development of your involvement in the field?
They're primarily people and the work that the people do. Obviously, Renzulli and Reese, I'm here at the University of Connecticut. It's no accident I'm here at the University of Connecticut. And so their work, Renzulli's 3-ring conception of giftedness, the idea that gifted is about doing something, that it's just not sitting there, that you need to be a creative producer. That's been a great influence on my life. Francois Gagne's work, Gagne's that you have these gifts, but you need to develop them. You have these talents, and it's the turning of the raw into something. That's been very influential in my work. Joyce Fantasso-Basca, her work in curriculum, in the importance of advanced curriculum, that's been very influential. And Carol Dweck, today everybody knows Carol Dweck's name, but in fact, I cited Carol Dweck in a Dweck and Leggett article in my dissertation before anybody knew about the mindsets, because her early work on performance goal orientation really influenced my thinking. So all of those have had an influence on me.
So what were the pivotal experiences leading to your contribution?
The first was working with the kids in Montana. That was life-changing for me. The second was the Ph.D. program at the University of Connecticut, because you have this opportunity to be surrounded by some amazing talent. I had Joe Renzulli for a professor, and Sally Reese, and Deb Burns, and Jean Gubbins, and Karen Westberg. And they're all in the office every day, so you just interact with them, you have lunch with them. And then I was fortunate to be with a cohort of very talented doc students. Jan Lapine was a doc student here when I was here, Stuart Omdahl, Tom Hebert, Terry New, Jean Purcell, Flo Kayard. And so we were a very tight group also. And so that just changed my life. And we're friends for life as a result of that. So I've never felt alone in the field. A lot of times when we go to conferences and like the University Network, and people will come to the University Network at the NAGC conference, and they just are so excited to be able to talk to somebody who has this passion about gifted ed and who's doing the kind of work they are. We don't really experience that here at the University of Connecticut, because we're just surrounded with that. In the summer, when our 3 summer students come to work on the masters, we're getting a whole new input of practitioners coming in with what's happening out in the field, and bringing in great ideas and telling us issues they're wrestling with. And so it's just a very good place to be. So being here as a doc student made a big difference. The other is my leadership opportunities both in CEC TAG and NAGC. Quite early on, I was on the CEC TAG, the Association for Gifted Board, and that gave me an opportunity to interact with people like Tracy Cross and Susan Johnson, Dan Montgomery. There were just lots of great people on that TAG board, and so that was just a wonderful experience, and I made some lifetime friends. And then I ended up on the NAGC board, and that's where I first officially met Joyce Fantasso-Basca and Sydney Moon and Carol Ann Tomlinson and Carolyn Callahan and a wide variety of those individuals. And so that work in leadership really has helped my scholarship, and it's helped me to develop both as a person and as a scholar. So that's another great place where you can develop your talent. And then the last is actually for our center now, the National Center for Research on Gifted Ed, because we've got this great team of researchers and we've collaborated with other universities. And so that's really giving me a talent, an opportunity to develop my talent and do some very interesting and important work.
It sounds like your model, right? An environment that supported you.
Yes, and I've been very fortunate to have that and be surrounded by that, because a lot of individuals don't have that opportunity. So I felt very lucky to have met the people in the field that I have and to be friends with them. We're a relatively small field, and so literally you can associate and affiliate with these gods, these people who were gods in our minds when we started. And now they're friends, and in some cases, I'm actually the boss of some of them now because of positions I have, which is sort of ironic as I think about it.
So this next question is going to be a little bit redundant because you've already talked so much about people in the field who influenced you, but we're going to kind of hone in and just say who was important to your involvement in the field.
Okay. Jan Lapine was very important. She made the connection with Renzulli and Reese for me to come here for my Ph.D. program. We were both teachers in Montana, and she was interested in coming to Connecticut to get her Ph.D., and I think she wanted some company, and we grew up about 100 miles from each other in Montana, and we're on our state board together. So Jan Lapine was a really big influence. Sally Reese has always been a big promoter and supporter of mine, as she is with everyone she's ever encountered. But Sally has created opportunities for me and Joe has also created opportunities for me that I wouldn't have had. I got my first job, my first university position, probably because of Joe Renzulli. I was totally unqualified for the job. It wasn't a job in gifted ed at Boise State. It was a job in teaching research design, and they wanted someone who had had experience advising doc students, and I was just finishing my dissertation at the time. But Renzulli, when he wrote my letter for my application, he put in a line in there that I thought would cause me not to get the job, and it was that if you're not completely pleased with Dell's performance as a professor, I will publicly eat this letter of recommendation. And I thought, oh my God, who's gonna take this seriously? But in fact, they saw that letter. Joe had a reputation beyond gifted ed, and they said, wow, we got to take a look at this guy. And fortunately, I had a great interview, and they hired me, and so my career started there at Boise State.
Okay, so as we go through our careers, we sometimes have controversies.
Oh.
Have there been controversies related to your work?
Probably not enough. Joe Renzulli told me a story about an interaction he had with Paul Torrance, and when Renzulli started his 3-ring conception, he was really beat up over it, and it was not very popular. And he was talking with Paul Torrance about it, and Torrance said to him, boy, you really must be onto something here. Anything that causes this much controversy has to have something to it. And so it's actually a compliment when people take on certain ideas, because you're starting to rock the status quo somewhat. But I think the only thing has been this, my downplay on self-regulation a little bit. And it's not that I don't think self-regulation is important, but teaching gifted kids study skills and self-regulation skills, many of them need it, and it is important. But if they don't value the task, and if they don't think they have the ability to do it, and if they don't feel supported, teaching them those skills, they are not going to engage. Those skills are necessary to engage. And being successful at those skills, as your research found, feeds back and increases their self-efficacy, their confidence, and making things meaningful. So it does feed back. But in isolation, I don't believe they work that well. And that is somewhat controversial because self-regulation and study skills, it's a big area, and a lot of people believe in it, and there's some very good researchers like Barry Zimmerman and others who have done a lot of great research on it. But if you don't have those attitudes, I think it's pretty hard to self-regulate.
So have there been misinterpretations or misapplications of the work you've done?
I think there's a little misinterpretation on the here I have my 3 rings just like Renzulli, but my 3 rings are the self-efficacy and the meaningfulness and the support. You have to have all 3, so it's multiplicative. And what that means is whenever you multiply anything times 0, you get 0. And so if you don't think your work is going to be supported and valued, you're not going to do it, probably. Or you're not going to give it your full effort. So you've got a 0 and nothing happens. Or if you don't think you have the skill to do it, you're not going to try it. So you've got a 0. And everything else doesn't matter, even if you think in a supportive environment and even if you think that it is meaningful. So that multiplicative nature of that anytime any of those 3 is missing, there are problems. And people tend to want to make it additive, that they're cumulative. And they don't all have to be of equal size, but there has to be something there. And that causes a problem with researchers actually who are using the model, because as they're measuring those 3, they're trying to see how those 3 predict maybe achievement. And so they're trying to build these models, but that group all has to exist. And so it's a little hard in developing models to test the achievement orientation model because of that multiplicative piece, because it's not enough to just have each of them leading over. They all have to all be leading over. And so sometimes people have found that things don't work quite as the model shows, but it's because of that multiplicative nature of that.
So did you suffer any defeats or disappointments as you worked in the field, and do you have any regrets?
None. No. I've been really fortunate. I've been fortunate to be supported, both having my research supported. We're very fortunate to get the National Center this time. The University of Connecticut had had it for a number of years, and then the Javits funding stopped for a while, and IES doesn't feel that centers should stay in the same place, that they should move around. So, the odds were sort of against us that we were going to get it this round. And so we knew that we had to put together a really crackerjack team to pull this off. And we did. And so I'm just really fortunate to be able to work with the team that I have right now. I was fortunate to be able to meet Risa Renzulli. I was fortunate to be on the NAGC board at a time when Joyce Fantasso-Basca was on there. So I got to know her and work well with her, and Ann Robinson and Paula Shevsky-Kabilius and different people. So no, I don't feel like I've had any disappointments.
Or defeats? Or regrets?
I guess I don't feel them as defeats. They have been side trips. So, you have this plan and you're headed in a direction and it doesn't go the way you plan, then you take another path. It's sort of like the Robert Frost poem of two roads in the woods. But it's not a defeat. It's just a change in what you're doing. And if you look at it as a defeat, you'll never accomplish anything in life. And so these setbacks they just create new opportunities for you. So that's what they are. Setbacks are opportunities to try other things. So for example, when I was 24, 25 years old, I started going blind. Okay, I'm a photographer. There aren't a lot of calls for blind photographers. I was told at 18 that I would be blind someday, but I didn't care. I was going to be a photographer anyway. It wasn't going to happen, and then it did happen when I was 26. But that caused me to go to college because I couldn't do photography anymore. It was before autofocus cameras. That caused me to go to college and get involved in education. Then I had my corneal transplants, which brought my vision back. And so that wasn't a defeat at all. That was a new opportunity. And so any of those things in our lives that we encounter, they're new opportunities. If you're fired from your job, wow, this is a new opportunity to explore something else.
It's a really positive attitude. So one of the things in gifted education is that we really don't have a standard definition for what giftedness is. I have a friend who once said to me, I was gifted in Michigan, but I'm not gifted in Virginia. So my next question sort of keys in on that. How do you define giftedness?
Well, I guess I would ask this person who was gifted in Michigan but not gifted in Virginia, what performance was she doing that she suddenly stopped doing? When giftedness is defined as potential, and there are various ways to measure potential, we get into trouble. And the field is often criticized because there are these lists of very eminent individuals who were not selected for gifted programs. We see it all the time, you know. So-and-so was not selected for a gifted program, you know. And so that sort of implies that gifted programs aren't any good, and that's not true. This idea that we can predict eminence, there are some performance and some factors that do help predict eminence a little bit, but we're not great at that. So what we have to do is we have to look at kids or adults, if you're developing talent in adults, and we have to look at what they're doing. And we figure out what their strengths are and what their talents are, and we work to develop them to the next level. Not because they're going to be eminent someday, but because they have that right to have their talents developed. And so we have to look at performance. And I know we like this idea of potential, but we have to look at performance, and we have to look at skills that kids have, but we have to look at it in context. And that's where our problem has been many for kids of poverty or EL kids. So that an EL kid, so this child does not speak English. We have this brilliant little person who just speaks another language. And so suddenly this kid can't receive gifted services because he doesn't do well on this English test that he can't read. The kid can't read, must not be gifted. But in fact, this is a brilliant little person. So you have to consider the context. I saw a speaker a couple of weeks ago, and she said she didn't like the word ability. She liked context. She didn't like someone saying somebody doesn't have the ability to be successful. She liked someone did not have the context to be successful. And so there are lots of things that go into that context. So we're all about ability. I mean, we need to recognize ability and develop it further. But those who aren't revealing their giftedness, we need to take a second look and look at the context of their lives. Okay, so I grew up in a very rural, poor community, all right? So no one in my family had gone to college. My dad finished 8th grade. So that context, it took a long time. It took 8 years after I graduated from high school to get the idea that I could go to college. So it makes a difference. If you've never heard a violin or seen someone play the violin, you might have potential to be the greatest violinist in the world, but if you're not exposed to it, it's not going to happen. That's why the type 1s from Renzulli's work are so important, because they're exposing kids to a wide variety of things so those talents can develop. And so we have to be about talent development, and we should be less worried about this anointment of gifted. So your friend probably had a high IQ, and the IQ cutoff was a little different in one state than the other. But if your friend is achieving great in mathematics, that mathematics achievement did not disappear when your friend moved to Virginia. And if they would look at what your friend was producing, the mathematics skills were still there, and so the giftedness was still there, just because we had a slightly different score on an IQ. And IQ is a predictor of how well you should do in school, and it's not a bad predictor, but it is not the be-all and end-all. And if you are doing well, then who cares what that IQ is?
That's interesting.
Sorry, I got a little preachy there.
No, and it's going to tie into this next question quite well, I believe. So what do you believe is the biggest challenge to the field?
Our failure to recognize underserved populations. Poverty, the effects of poverty on children's lives there are just so many effects. And you know, our research shows, for example, that the higher the poverty in the school, the less likely you're going to be identified as gifted, even with high achievement. So these high poverty schools, they simply often do not have the resources to provide the services, even when the state mandates that those services exist. So we've done work in states that have a mandate to identify and a mandate to serve, and yet we still see high poverty kids not getting identified who have the same achievement as non-high poverty kids who are getting identified. And we also see that the more poverty that exists in that school, the probability of getting identified keeps dropping as poverty increases. And in some states, that correlation is phenomenally negative and phenomenally high. So we have to take a look at underserved, and EL as also. You know, we've had a movement in our field for the twice exceptional, which is very important. And this is not a put down of twice exceptional, because that is an important push, and thank God we looked at that. But we also have to look at EL and poverty issues, because there are these brilliant little people who just happen to speak a different language, and they're totally being discredited, and their talent is totally being ignored. So we have to take a look at underserved populations and do a better job, both of identifying them and serving them, and reaching out to the community.
So what direction do you believe is most important for the field?
I think we need to as I said earlier, I think we need to move away from this prediction. We're predicting eminence. I think we have, but some people still feel that, when you get the gifted label, you're sort of anointed. And as a parent, thank gosh, my child is gifted. Okay, I'm kind of guaranteed success in life. They're not guaranteed success in life. Your child has some real talent there. The success in life depends on your child's motivation, your child's creativity, and how well your child's talents get developed. And so if we can develop kids' talents, we're in much better shape than saying you're gifted, you're not gifted. I'll have to throw in about my daughter. So my daughter started reading at 1.5, which is very young. And what had happened is she started memorizing words, which is how many kids start to read. And so she memorized the shapes of words. So she didn't know the difference between Coke and cake because they looked similar, or mommy and money also looked similar to her. But for Jessica, as she learned to talk, she learned to read. So any word she spoke, she could read, because if we wrote the word out for her and she saw it and repeated it, she could read. So by the time she was 3, she was a fluent reader. When she went to preschool, we told the school she could read. One day our child care person picked her up from preschool, and the preschool teacher said, Jessica can read. And the preschool teacher, which we had already mentioned, our child care person said, yes, no. And the preschool teacher said, no, Jessica can read. I said, yes, okay. Is Jessica gifted? Okay. At that point, she was performing way above what would be expected. So yes, so she needed services. And when she went to kindergarten in 1st grade, she needed something different for reading than other kids. But she's in 5th grade now, and she reads just like all the other kids, maybe a little faster, and she has great comprehension, but she really doesn't need a lot of specialty work in reading now. And so it's sort of, you have to figure out where this kid is and what this kid needs right now. And granted, she can move further in her reading. I'm not saying she can't, but the real need happened quite early. Now, if some other talent of hers starts to surface right now, then she needs some help in developing that one.
So maybe gifts and talents can be situational.
Yeah, I think they can. And they're age specific too, to some extent. But they involve some sort of performance or some sort of showing this skill, okay? And that performance might be on an IQ test, so I'm not going to put those down, which indicates something. But you need to do something. I'm 6'1", and I grew up in a small town, and so I probably was the tallest male in my graduating class. I didn't play basketball. And they needed everybody on that team they could, because this is a small town. But I had vision issues. The last thing I didn't have depth perception. The last thing I wanted was a bunch of balls flying at me. And so I just had no interest in that. Okay. So on my rings, I probably didn't have that much ability, but I could have, but it wasn't meaningful to me. You could call me an underachieving basketball player because I was 6'1". So the raw was there, the height was there, but I wasn't playing basketball. So having this great potential and doing nothing with it doesn't make you gifted. I was not a gifted basketball player. If I had been 7 foot, I'd have been highly gifted basketball player and a highly rated underachiever at that point. But it's what we do and what we produce that makes the difference.
So there are a lot of people out there who are maybe considering gifted education as a profession or a field they want to enter. What advice would you give to young professionals who are interested in gifted education?
For teachers, I would say learn everything you can about it and go in to that classroom with a real appreciation for talent and have confidence in yourself, because when you're not confident, and these kids will challenge you, and the kids will know more than you do about topics, it is totally okay. It's totally okay to let them teach you. When I was a professor, when I was a student, an undergrad, the Apple computer came out for the first time. And the university where I was bought one, and they immediately locked it in a closet because it was such a valuable thing. And I was just dying to see how that worked. And so I had a math professor who said, tell you what, I'll give you a key to that closet if you'll learn how to use it and then teach me. He said, because you have more time than I do, so go ahead and do that. So he gave me the key to the closet, gave me a 3-credit independent study, and I learned how to program the little Apple at that time. And then I taught him. And he said, you know, you had more time, but I have more knowledge than you do. And I have some wisdom, and I see ways that this can be used that you don't see yet. And he did. He saw uses in art and music way before anybody else. And he said, it's going to be the same way when you teach, that those kids are going to have time and they're going to have knowledge that you don't have. And that was really the best advice for me, is that let these kids teach you. And at times I let them teach you, because your job is to guide them and find them resources. And you don't have to know it all, but you do have to have, if you're going to teach math, you better have some math skills. So that advice is to be open and have this kind of community of learners going on with your students. I think that's good advice in the field. As a researcher, read the research and study it and familiarize yourself with it. So many people don't have good background. Find out what all the mistakes were so that you don't repeat them, and so that you can build on that research. So you do really need to read the research. And then secondly, you need to develop your skills, research skills, or find somebody who has them. In my case, I'm married to Betsy McCoach, who's pretty eminent in the research methodology world. So if I don't have those, I have Betsy, so I can talk with her about them. And so you need to either hone those skills or find some collaborators who have them, so that you can really do some good research.
So what thoughts do you have when you reflect on your work in the field?
I'm just trying to make a difference for kids. I'm just trying to figure out how to help kids value things that will help make their lives easier. I don't know if I explained that very well, but having some good math knowledge opens a lot of doors. You don't have to become a mathematician or an engineer, but just having those skills. And a lot of times kids fail to appreciate all of this. I have a quote I use when I speak from Einstein that talks about curriculum. And he says that curriculum is a gift that all generations before you handed to you. Because if you think about it, all the learning that existed, that's what curriculum is. And it was created by all these people in all these countries over time. And that's a beautiful gift. And so kids need to understand that the things they learn in school are important. And so I'm just trying to figure out, how do you make that meaningful for them?
And that ties into your achievement orientation model?
Right, that's why it started.
Yeah. So in the future, what directions do you see yourself moving in?
Well, I was moving in, trying to figure out how things were meaningful, okay? And then I got this little sidetrack, because we got this nice little grant from the federal government to study underserved populations, and it just really has become a passion for me. And so that work right now into the future, we have a lot of data, and there are a lot of secrets still that data holds, because we've done hundreds of interviews and looked at hundreds of thousands of student scores. And so that work will go on well past the funding of the research center, I hope. And then I also want to get back to my meaningfulness, because I've got lots of clues in other people's work. Renzuli's work on type 1s, type 2s, type 3s feeds nicely into what makes something meaningful. So those two parallel tracks, hopefully I'll have some time to work on those.
So do you have any personal talents yourself, like music or sports or science, that influenced your work in gifted education?
I was a fairly successful photographer at quite an early age. Actually, when I was 19, had a picture in Time magazine for the first time. But I was working in a much smaller market, but that was a great opportunity for that. So my photography skills were pretty good. I think I'm a good teacher, and I've won some teaching awards, and I think I'm a pretty gifted teacher, actually. People are always uncomfortable when they're asked, are you gifted or not? And people feel, ugh. But you know, if we have these students and we're giving them that label, we should be a little comfortable with it ourselves. So yeah, I'm able generally to take some pretty complex topics and present them in a simple, easy way to understand. And so I've been fairly successful at teaching. So I think my teaching, I don't think I'm a gifted researcher. I think my wife is a gifted researcher, Betsy McCoach. I'm contributing, and I want to make a difference. My leadership skills have been pretty good, been pretty successful. I enjoyed being president of NAGC, and it was a great time to be president. We did a lot with advocacy, which was kind of a nice accomplishment, because NAGC during my presidency really became much more involved in advocacy at the national level, and also to help states in their advocacy efforts. So leadership is something I think I do well. I'm not a great manager, and you know, people often confuse leadership and management. Grace Hopper, who wrote some of the earliest computer programs, and I think the term computer bug is actually attributed to Grace Hopper, and she was an admiral in the Navy as well. She was lamenting business practices in a 60 Minutes interview, and she said, well, businesses concentrate on business management, and it should be about leadership, because there's a difference between being a leader and a manager. And so I've worked hard to be a good leader. I'd like to be a good manager too, but I think I'm probably better at the leadership, so I may have some skills there as well.
And I think you've answered all of it. Were you a gifted child, gifted adult, and do you walk in this field? And you covered most of that.
I play in it.
You do. Is there anything else you would like to add?
First, I'd like to thank you for doing this, and I'd like to thank the Conceptual Foundations group for actually organizing this and executing it. I think, you know, I have this motto: every child has a right to learn something new every day, and that was developed with my wife, Betsy McCoach. But you know, every child has a right to learn something new every day. And just because a child comes from a rural area, or from poverty, or speaks a different language, or happens to know everything the teacher's going to teach that day, that child does not sacrifice that right. And what gifted education is about is making sure that every child has that right to learn something new every day. And where we failed is for some populations not being able to do that. And so as we move forward, we need to make sure that every child does have a right to learn something new every day, and that they don't sacrifice it because of the language they speak or because of the environment they grew up in. And so we have a lot of work to do in our field. We're doing a lot of great work now, and so it's just really, it's an honor to work with the people I work with, and it's an honor to know everyone in the field of gifted education. And it was an honor to teach those kids in Montana so many years ago.
Well, I'd like to thank you for all of your work that you've done in the field, and for agreeing to be part of the Conceptual Foundation's Legacy Archive. So thank you, Dr. Siegle.
Thank you very much.